The goal of our paper was to try and understand how cruise ship tourists disperse through destinations at the end of their cruise. This study was conducted in Sydney and was funded by the Ports Authority of New South Wales. We started the research and the fieldwork in particular in January 2020, and unfortunately, we got stopped by COVID. But in the meantime, we managed to gather a small amount of data that gave us some really interesting insights into what cruise ship passengers do at the end of their cruise. Much of the previous research that has been done in cruise ships tourists has focused on what cruise ship tourists do while they're actually transit passengers and in port. But this study was a little bit different. We wanted to know what cruise ship tourists did once their cruise was finished and when they got off the boat, well, the ship, where they actually went. So we used technology to do this, and in particular, we used the tourism tracer technology that was developed down in the University of Tasmania. Our large team set out to do a pretty lofty fieldwork program. And what we did was we recruited passengers as they departed from the ship at the end, on the very last day of their cruise. We managed to recruit around 75 people who gave us usable data. We recruited a little bit more than that, but after the cleaning, we had 75 downloads to work with. And what we did was we divided them into three groups. We had international tourists, we had Sydney-siders, those who lived in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, and we also had a third group of passengers who we called the domestic tourists, and they were Australians who had finished their cruise. So when they departed, we asked them to put the Tourism Tracer app on their mobile phones. The Tourism Tracer app, as some of you may know, is an app which has integrated GPS technology, so it's able to track people where they go down to about 2 meters of accuracy. And it also has a survey that tells us a lot about that person in terms of their socio-demographic status. So what did we actually find? Well, we found some really interesting stuff. One of the things that was highlighted in the paper was that we looked at maximum linear distance. So that is the furthest point between the cruise ship and where that particular tourist went. And we found that the three groups that we studied varied quite a lot. International passengers tended to travel a lot less than the others. So the average maximum linear distance that we found them was travelling was around 26 kilometres. The average for Sydney-siders was about 31 kilometres away from port, and the average for domestic visitors was a whopping 142 kilometres from the port. So we could see some big differences in this dispersal. We also synced our GPS data with land use data that we got from the Department of Planning and the Environment from New South Wales, Australia. And they have divided all the land around Sydney and New South Wales into categories. So we synced our GPS data with that to see what type of land use the tourists were going to. We actually found some really interesting differences. International visitors, when they stayed close to port after the end of the cruise, and we found that we could largely see them in the service and commercial and recreation zones. The domestic visitors we saw in the similar land use zones close to port, but as they dispersed farther away from the port, we could see that they tended to be found in service locations and residential locations. So we could see different use of land uses between the different types of tourists. This project, which unfortunately had to pull up stumps around about middle of March when COVID hit, as did many other research projects, I think we found some really interesting data that aligned with existing research and also challenged other research. So in terms of our alignment, we aligned with research by Navarro and Ruiz that was put out in 2020. We found that international visitors tend to really stay close to port. So that was a study of transit passengers. Ours was a study of departing passengers. And again, we find them close to port, not dispersing very far. But our research differed a little because we could find big differences between international passengers and domestic tourists. The domestic passengers tended to disperse much farther throughout New South Wales, Australia. So what does this mean for the tourism industry? There are a few interesting implications. We feel that this research suggests that there's a real need to incentivise international passengers to encourage them to disperse farther into Sydney, beyond Sydney and through New South Wales. And the same probably applies to different destinations. So we need to test that. For the industry, we also found that domestic passengers, they don't necessarily need incentives to disperse because they're dispersing quite far, but what they need is encouragement to continue to engage in tourism activities once they disperse past the area very close to port, because once they go past that port area, they tend to be engaged in more activities that are less tourism focused according to the land use zones. So this project was really fun. It was a big logistical exercise, but we think it found some interesting results. So we hope you enjoyed as much as we did. Thank you.